Morning, my dear students.
Morning, sir.
Today is the 7th day of the month of February 2023. Yes, and so we are continuing our lectures on petroleum law or oil and gas law. And our focus today is on international law as it impacts the exploration and exploitation of oil and gas resources, or the international aspects of petroleum law with respect to the exploration and exploitation of offshore resources. I think I prepared the first title. So we will jump in. Second, I want to also record the audio. Voice. For some reason, I'm having problems to search. So if somebody has a phone, you can record the audio. But recall, okay, so just by way of emphasis that petroleum is located or can be located onshore or offshore in what you call geographic parcels, which for purpose of administration by home states are referred to as blocks, what you call an oil block, and state governments are usually authorized to administer these petroleum resources by interacting with private oil companies for the most part, although in some exceptional cases they may also rely almost exclusively on their national oil company, as the case may be. Over time, it was felt that petroleum could also be so today is the 7th of February 2023, and we are looking at the international law as it impacts the development of petroleum resources. Okay, so I was trying to give us a foundation so that we'll have perspective that over time it was felt that there was also petroleum located offshore, and if that is the case, how are countries going to develop these resources amicably without having some form of acrimony, because it has generally been understood for centuries, long before the discovery of petroleum, that the high seas, what you call international waters, do not actually belong to any country. It had always been felt that the high seas was the common heritage of mankind, and petroleum, the petroleum industry effectively was born in the middle part of the 19th century, when oil was discovered by a man called Colonel Drake in a place called Titusville, I think so, Titusville or in Pennsylvania and all that. So petroleum law came after the international law had already been developed on this subject. So the question now is, to what extent can states, coastal states in a sense, be able to exploit for and develop petroleum resources that are located near to them or adjacent to their shorelines, as the case may be? So learning outcomes, by the end of this class, you should be able to understand the legal framework for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources in inland or internal waters, in the continental shelf, the exclusive economic zone, the contiguous zone, and the territorial waters of states. You will also be able to understand, at the end of this class, you should be able to understand the position of Nigeria and the legal framework that has been put in place to enable Nigeria as a country to exploit for and develop petroleum resources. And lastly, you should be able to understand the position of the coastal states within Nigeria. So Nigeria as a country is a coastal state, but inside of Nigeria we have landlocked states. Most of the states, virtually all the states in eastern Nigeria are landlocked. But we have coastal states, or what you call littoral states, like Bayelsa, Rivers, Ondo, Delta, as the case, Lagos State, as the case may be. So you should be able to understand at the end of this lecture the position of these states vis-a-vis the central government or the Federal Republic of Nigeria in the sharing of petroleum resources that are located in these offshore waters. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Good. So I said here in my introduction that modern technology allows for the search and production of petroleum in the maritime and non-maritime areas of the world. And such activities are now recognized and validated by international law. Again, as a result of technological developments, the seabed is now capable of effective occupation, and international law has sought to give maritime or coastal states extended rights to natural resources that are located adjacent to or near their territories. Some terminologies again that you need to have a firm grasp of: the territorial sea, please note them down. The territorial sea, the high seas, the exclusive economic zone, the contiguous zone, the internal waters, and lastly the continental shelf. I take it again: territorial sea, high seas, exclusive economic zone, contiguous zone, internal waters, continental shelf. Under the continental shelf, some other terminologies you will need to know: what we call the continental slope, continental rise, and continental margin. Continental slope, continental rise, continental margin. Now, I told us that international law has now been developed to an extent whereby it has delineated the rights of states to develop and exploit petroleum resources offshore. How did this happen? For we to look at that, you need to understand that for international law, we have two basic sources of international law. They can actually be more. Article 38 of the Statute of the ICJ lists about 5 of them, but the two cardinal sources of international law are what you call customary international law and statutory international law, or statutory international law, or treaty-based international law. So under the first customary international law, the law is developed by virtue of the practices of states, accepted over time as being binding to a large number of states. Francis, are you with me?
Yes.
Just like basic customs in Ijaw land, we have customs that are not necessarily written down, but they are accepted as binding. That if you are getting married to a woman, you have to see the father, you have to pay dowry and all that. And over time, these customs have now been accepted as binding. In Ijaw land, for example, if your wife dies, you can't bury your wife in your place. Is that not so? You must take the corpse to where she was married from. In other traditions, you can, but in Ijaw land, they can go to war for that, something as simple as that. So it's a custom, and everybody accepts it. It doesn't have to be written down. That same idea is brought to bear in international law. My daughter, I've forgotten that your good name.
Kuro.
Yes, Kuro. Is it Kuro?
Yes.
K-U-R-O?
Yes.
That is a strong name. It means strength. Is that not so? Yeah. Okay. Can we continue, please? So I just want to reiterate again. I know I've given us foundation on this topic, but for purpose of the recording, I'm laying foundation. Are you with me? Yeah. So we have a number of conventions, two basic convention headings. First of all, there was the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, of 1958. United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea of 1958, that gave rise to, out of that conference, 4 conventions were born. What you call the Geneva Convention, because it was held in Geneva and that is in Switzerland. And together, these conventions provide for the limits of the territorial sea, the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea, and the use of the high seas. And I'll just mention them. Number one is the Convention on the Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone, the CTSZ, Convention on the Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone, CTSCZ, which entered into force on the 10th of September 1964. Then there was a convention, or there is a convention on the high seas, or what we call the High Seas Convention, which came into effect on the 30th of September 1962. There was a convention on fishing and conservation of the living resources of the high seas. Convention on the fishing and conservation of the living resources of the high seas came into effect on 20th of March 1966. And lastly, there was a convention on the continental shelf itself, which came into effect 10th of June 1964. In addition to these conventions, there was an optional protocol or signature concerning the compulsory settlement of disputes and all that. Then, like I said, so that is the first heading, the convention. 4 conventions were born. Again, may remove that chair, let me see your face. Push the chair. So 4 conventions were born, yes, my dear, out of, are you seated well? Sit here. You are not comfortable, and that is not even a seat. Thank you, daughter. Your name again?
Blessing, sir.
Blessing. Blessing what?
Frederick.
Frederick. Excellent. You are a good girl. That is my impression of you. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
I believe so. Okay, and so there was the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So 4 conventions, and then in 1982, we now had this United Nations Convention, which is a very elaborate and robust piece of legislation, usually referred to as UNCLOS 1982. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
So let's now look at the legal regime, first of all, for the internal waters and the territorial sea. Internal waters and the territorial sea. And for that, there are some terminologies we may want to just explain, and so that when we use them, we'll use them advisedly in order to ensure that we avoid ambiguity or confusion. Thank you, Lord. First of all, is territorial waters. When we refer to territorial waters, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? Territorial waters. It depends on who is using it and the sense in which they are using it. Are you with me? Yes, it's not a legal terminology. Territorial waters is not a legal terminology. So it could be used in a sense to embrace the territorial sea, the internal waters, the exclusive economic zone, the contiguous zone, and the continental shelf. In a sense, a country may be referring to territorial waters as including all that body of water over which it has some level of jurisdiction. Are you with me?
Yes.
Some level of jurisdiction, to some extent sovereignty, and to other extent the right to exploit for natural resources. So I may not have the right to exercise sovereignty over the exclusive economic zone, but because international law has given me the right to exploit for natural resources there, I could call it my territorial water because it's an exclusive right. I can exclude you from developing. Are you with me? So in that sense, we could say the territorial waters covers all of these waters. In a more narrow sense, when we now refer to sovereignty, we could say the territorial waters refer to the territorial sea and a country's internal waters, because in these 2 areas, the country can exercise absolute sovereignty. Are you with me? Are you with me?
Yes, sir.
Yes. In an even more narrower sense, the term territorial waters can be used synonymously with territorial sea. Territorial sea. And so here we are excluding the internal waters, but we are just making reference to the territorial sea. So now let's start by looking at what are the internal waters. What are the internal waters of a country? And for this, I think I will want to make use of my board. I don't want to off this thing yet. No, catch fire. Okay. Video me. I need a pen. Does anybody have any pen?
Hold on.
So let's assume that this is the shoreline. Are you with me? What are we explaining? Internal waters. Okay, so this is the shoreline, and this is the territorial sea, which we said is 12 nautical miles. We'll come to it. Any body of water internally into a country, let's assume it's Nigeria, can be referred to as our internal waters. Is that clear?
Yes.
So all that body of water that is not a part of the territorial sea, you know, the inward, that comes inward to the country, you cannot video me, can be referred to as the territorial water. So it has been defined in Article 5. Article 5 on the Convention on the Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone, and Article 8 of UNCLOS, as all waters on the landward side of the territorial sea, all waters of the landward side of the territorial sea. It includes parts of the sea that are neither the high seas nor the territorial sea. It appertains to the land territory of the coastal states. It appertains to the land territory of the coastal states. And there's no right of innocent passage for any other state. So in the internal waters is a part and parcel of the state, and you know that every country under international law has the right to exercise sovereignty. Territorial sovereignty is the most cardinal feature of sovereignty. Are you with me?
Yes.
You cannot say you have sovereignty if you do not have territorial and the power to exercise and impose your will within that territory. Okay, so within your internal waters, you can a state can exercise jurisdiction over foreign ships, and a flag state may also act where crimes have, of course, occurred on board the ship. So, just by way of passage, you come to most of these things in international law. It's just that when you come to international law, the focus will not be oil and gas. Are you with me? The lecturer, can we have light, please? The lecturer will be looking at international law when it comes to the land, law of the sea. When the lecturer comes to the law of the sea, his focus will not be on petroleum, but he will cover everything. So fishing and navigation and other subjects as the case may be. Why not take that thing up a bit? Yes, my son, I think it's better. But we don't want to dwell too much time. So we want to now look at the territorial sea. Territorial sea. So I'll just read for purpose of the recording. Initially, it was imperative for states to dominate and extend their jurisdiction over waters within the range of a cannon shot from shore batteries. Sovereignty, therefore, was thought to extend as far as the power of the arm could go. And during that period, a cannon shot extended to 3 miles from the shore. As a result, it became generally and internationally accepted as the area over which a coastal mission or a coastal state could exercise control. Tarila, thank you for all that you are doing. So, initially it was felt that the territorial sea of a country could only extend to 3 nautical miles And I told you that the criteria they used was to use the cannon shot. The cannon is like a gun. Are you with me?
Yes.
Yeah. So if the highest extent to which a cannon could go should be used as a determining criteria for defining the territorial sea. And so if it was 3 miles, then let it be so. And so it became the culture or the custom over time for countries to use 3 nautical miles to define the territorial sea. But the UNCLOS today provides for 12 nautical miles. Are you with me? 12 nautical miles. So what is the territorial sea? Let me just say it again. My son, you turn the video again to me. You will do some work today, and for which I will be grateful to you. Thank you, Lord. So what is the territorial sea? It is a belt of sea or waters which is adjacent to a country's coast. You see that again in Article 1 of the Convention on the Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zone. At international law, the baseline for measuring the breadth of the territorial sea is the low water mark along the coast. Article 3 of the same Contiguous Zone and Convention, and Article 5 of UNCLOS. So let's assume that, again, this is Nigeria, and then this is now the sea. We'll now enter into the sea. This is the sea, S-E-A. What we are saying is that we have to count 12 nautical miles. Are you with me?
Yes,
12 nm. You cannot go beyond that. So this is 12 nm. And to determine what is to determine the extent of water that we call the territorial sea, we have to use what they call the low water mark. And I gave us the explanation that in some rivers we have these frequent tides. Are you with me?
Yes, sir.
Particularly if you go towards our Nembe axis, brass axis, you will see the sea rising and going up. Are you with me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, so the low water mark. So when the water is full, it may get to this level. And I tell children not to go, because you could just drown. When the water has gone down, you may be able to walk up to here. Is that so?
Yes.
Who has stayed in Nembe before? Small. Who has experienced this anywhere? Tidal movements. Francis, where did you experience it? Opoma, excellent. You are from there? Okay, what of you, my daughter? Idema. Is it an Nembe axis?
Yes.
You have experienced it. What of you, Grace?
I've seen it.
Yes. So when the water has gone down, you can even walk, play. But when the water begins to rise, better move, because you can get to this level. And so to count these 12 nautical miles, we will not use when the water is high. We will use the low water mark. And that is where we now say this is territorial sea, 12 nautical miles. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
So international law allows states to exercise sovereignty over their territorial sea, even though it doesn't belong to them. The sea belongs to no one. You remember?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it is only your internal waters that belong to you. So let's assume that this is the low water mark extends to 1 mile. Please listen. Let's assume that the low water mark extends to 1 mile. This is where you start from. This remaining 1 mile is part of your what? Internal waters. Are you with me? Even though it is part of the sea, it is not part of the territorial sea. And so for here, you can exercise absolute sovereignty, even though it is part of the sea. But the moment it gets to the territorial sea, your right naturally ends. You are not able to exercise this right because international law has now given it to you. Are you with me? So say that from this low water mark down to 12 nautical miles, you have the right to now exercise sovereignty. The only limit to exercise of sovereignty is to allow other ships what they call the rights of what? Innocent passage. Excellent. Innocent or safe passage. Ships may fly. Before they fly, they will have to take permission from you. Before, boats, airplanes, sorry. And before ships will pass, they have to take permission from you. If they are hostile, they can't move. If they are carrying ammunitions, they cannot move without permission. But other than that, you have to allow ships to have the right of safe, innocent passage. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Lord.
Just to point out that many coastlines are not straight, but are indented or penetrated by bays, sandbanks, and harbor installations. I want to explain something. Many coastlines are not straight, but are indented or penetrated by bays, sandbanks, and harbor installations. What I'm trying to say is that so we are saying that this is Nigeria and this is our coastline. Are you with me? It is very easy to determine the territorial sea if you have a straight coastline like this, or you can just count. But in reality, it's not always like that. The coastline may come like this. Are you with me? Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes. So where do we now use to now determine our territorial sea? Do we use here? Do we use here? Do we use here? And all that. So you want to look at Article 4. Article 4 says, even though the coastlines may not be straight, but may be indented means that you push inside. Is that not so? A straight baseline can still be drawn so long as it follows the direction of the coast. A straight baseline, you will still attempt to draw, you are now drawing it, an imaginary line. Tyler, are you with me?
Yes.
Yes. You are using this last point and this last point to draw a straight baseline. From here, you will now measure your territorial sea. And like I said, the main thing you want to understand is that a country can exercise absolute sovereignty over the territorial sea. And so every natural resource that is there invariably belongs to that state, subject to the right of innocent passage. And that right of sovereignty extends to the airspace and seabed. And this sovereignty over the territorial sea is premised, is grounded on the need for states to gain control over an area open to the sea for their own self-preservation. It is necessary that you are able to have this buffer of 12 nautical miles for your own self-preservation, beyond which another country cannot enter, and the ship from that country cannot enter. Are you with me? If they are entering, you can declare war. I was watching a movie recently, Beyond Remorse is the name of the movie. I love to watch CIA. I don't know, but I like to watch CIA movies. And they were going to Russia to extract somebody who had come to America to commit an offense. And they were flying, and they were going to a place called Murmansk. And the moment they entered into the Russian airspace, the Russians had to attack them, because you have invaded our sovereignty. I don't know if you understand.
Yes.
So they told them to go back. They gave them first warning, second warning. They released bullets. They bombed the plane. Again, you know what happened in USA just 3-4 days ago about the balloon. Who knows about it?
China.
No. You know about it. I know you are reading. My daughter beat me. What happened? You don't know. What of you, Gebe? You don't know. What of you?
I
That's
don't know.
what we are saying. He knows. His CGPA may be 2.5. Your own may be 4.2. I will employ him first before I'll employ you. You don't know that is what happens. Some of you think it's just CGPA. Just go there. 4.2. Okay? The world don't move from that level. They want to know if you are versatile, if you are vast, if you can discuss on a wide range of issues. My son, tell us about it. What happened?
US exported balloons, Chinese balloons that were spying on the U.S. territory in the sea, so they had to shoot it down.
Excellent.
I think they gave them warning or so, but I'm not sure, but they shot it down.
So they saw these balloons flying, and for the Chinese, they said it was a mistake. You know, it was a balloon they were using for scientific research, and it veered into American airspace. But because of the level of tension that exists between China and the US, it was anything that comes from Chinese is already suspected. You know, it may not have been true. Is it recorded? It may actually have been true that it was not a spy mechanism, but suspicion has not allowed them to have that good relation. And what some people do is that they prey on their fears. Who has watched the movie The Sum of All Fears? The Sum of All Fears. Try and watch it. You watch movies, good films, and open up your head. Oh, I wish I could just be like you people and live my life again through you people. But I've done my own part. The Lord will help us in Jesus' name.
Amen.
The vast. Every day I read newspaper. Today I've read. I know what is happening. What is happening in Turkey and Syria? You know, thank God. To God be the glory. We go kill cow. What happened in Syria? The earthquake happened yesterday around 5 o'clock in the morning.
It was 1939.
Yes. Yesterday 1,800 people had died. Today it has risen up to 5,000. Over 3,000 homes were destroyed in Turkey. You know, you just read and just open up yourself. You don't know where they will ask you questions. I went for an interview in Abuja, and then 14 lawyers. They needed 6 from Bayelsa to work for the Federal Ministry of Justice. They will just ask you, who is the predecessor to the current Sultan of Sokoto? Of course, you have failed, because you are expecting them to ask you Section 305, the immunity, diplomatic immunity. No, state of emergency. That's what you are expecting. They won't ask you such questions. They asked that one, people failed. All the questions they asked me, I answered all of them. Of course, I got the job. I didn't even take it again. I had to tell them to touch somebody. So please, I hope I've emphasized the point enough.
Yes, sir.
If you like, take it. If you like, don't take it. If you want, some of you are comfortable with poverty. That is your own happiness. I don't just graduate here and come and suffer in Bayelsa. Move from one chamber to the other. They pay you 10,000 naira, 5,000 naira. Why some of your mates will from here get job in Chevron and be earning 2.5 million every month, 3 million every month. You be here and your principal is giving you 40,000 naira. And the thing we want, Shay, if you like, don't develop yourself. Recently, some of my young friends, my former students, went for NDDC scholarship exam. 2 of them. Somebody wanted to help them. He wanted to help them, so he had already spoken to some people. These ones are my candidates. They say yes, we'll help, but they still have to do inter what?
Yeah.
Because at the interview point, one of them failed. The other one is going abroad. $30,000 is what they're giving. Somebody from Waterside. Now God is lifting him. He's going to UK. Then I don't know where he go to, because he prepared himself. Okay. Pero we come back to what you are teaching. A word is enough for the word is enough. Okay, so yes. Now let's just know that beyond the territorial sea, we'll now start talking of the high sea proper. Beyond the territorial sea, you now start talking properly of the high sea. Now let's talk briefly about the contiguous zone. So let's move from the territorial sea and jump into what you will call the contiguous zone. Contiguous basically means something that is close, something that is near. Are you with me?
Yes.
Yes, and I said beyond the territorial sea. So this is the territorial sea, and we said it's 12 nm. Once you have left here, you now enter into the high sea proper. And I say you cannot exercise your sovereignty here. That does not mean you still do not have certain rights. Are you with me?
Yes.
It's just that those rights do not amount to sovereignty. And for international law, 24 miles from the baseline from which you calculate your territorial sea. So 12 plus 12 on top, making it 24, is referred to as this country's contiguous zone. Are you with me?
Yes.
You can exercise sovereignty over this 12 because it's territorial, but here you cannot exercise sovereignty. That notwithstanding, states may exercise control in furtherance of their territorial sea rights and ensure compliance with their municipal laws and regulations. So in the contiguous zone, a state may still exercise control in order to further its territorial sea rights and in order to ensure compliance with its municipal laws and regulations. So you can go there to enforce a right you already had here. You had a right here, it was violated here. Let's assume somebody came here and broke your law here. Are you with me? And if you can find him here, you can still exercise the rights here in this place. So it's called the contiguous zone. You want to look at Article 24 of the Contiguous Zone Convention and Article 33 of UNCLOS. See also Article 15 of UNCLOS. Article 15 of UNCLOS, where two states have what you call boundary overlap. What do they do about it? Please take your time and look at Article 15. Okay, so again, just to emphasize that in the contiguous zone, the state may prevent infringement of its customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary regulations that it had made within its territory or within its territorial sea. Now let's move on because of our time. Let's look at the high seas proper. The high seas proper. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Lord.
So, I said there's a convention on the high seas, and I said that the high sea begins where the territorial sea ends. Is that not so?
Yes.
Yes, so it's defined in Article 1 of the High Seas Convention as all that part of the sea that are not part of a country's internal waters or territorial sea. All that part of the sea that are not part of a country's internal waters or territorial sea. I emphasize that it is the common heritage of what? All mankind. You see that in Article 2. So the high sea is defined in Article 1, and then the common heritage principle is emphasized. Again, focus. Don't be reading when I'm teaching. The high seas, the common heritage of mankind, comfort, focus, close the book. Focuses on the common heritage of mankind principle is emphasized in Article 2. Is that okay?
Yes.
So the high sea is being open to all nations. No state may validly purport to subject any part of them to its sovereignty. But like you saw in the video we just watched, states, particularly maritime states that have capacity to conquer the sea, tend to want to go beyond the limits imposed by international law. But legally speaking, no state is meant to exercise sovereignty over the high sea. And there are some major freedoms over the high seas. We'll come to look at them very briefly. Just to emphasize that the UNCLOS, which was in 1982, also contains many important provisions directly concerning or relating to the high seas. The main provisions in this regard are to be found in parts 7, articles 87 to 120, part 7, which embraces articles 87 to 120, part 11, which deals with the common heritage of mankind, and also part 13, which deals with protection and preservation of the marine environment and marine scientific and all that. So now let's just talk about the freedoms that states have, freedom that all countries in the world have with respect to the where. I say originally they were 4, but UNCLOS has added 2 more. Originally they were freedom to navigate, freedom to fish, freedom to lay submarine cables and pipelines, and freedom to fly overseas. So originally those were the 4 freedoms that were recognized in 1958. But in 1982, 2 more freedoms were added: freedom to construct artificial islands and other installations permitted under international law, and freedom to conduct scientific research subject to part 6 and part 13 of UNCLOS. So basically I want you to note, just know that that is the basic law with respect to the high seas. So when you have time, look at the IC convention. I've sent them to you, have I not?
No,
Okay,
sir.
Tarila, remind me to send the conventions to you. I'll just run through the IC convention. Article 1 defines some salient provisions. Article 1 defines the high seas. Article 2 contains statement of principles. Article 3 makes provisions for access to the sea by landlocked states. What is a landlocked state? Grace?
A landlocked state is a state that does not have access to the sea.
Excellent example.
So I'll tell you.
Can somebody give an example?
Chad.
I think Niger as well. I'm not sure of Niger, but Chad, I'm 100% sure. I think Saudi Arabia also. I think Saudi Arabia, but I'm not sure again. You know, so some countries have access to the sea, or very tiny access. And for such countries, Sudan is landlocked as well. For such countries, access to the sea is very crucial and vital to their survival. And some countries are ready to go to war if you do not allow them to have access to the sea. Example, Israel went to war in 1956 and in 1967 because Egypt blocked access to the sea. You know, there's a place called, it's a canal, it's Suez Canal or so, that ships used to pass, you know, and when Israel had this tension with its Arab neighbors, one of the ways they felt they could use to punish her was to block access to the sea. Are you with me?
Yes, sir.
And they warned them once and twice and said, blocking the sea is, you have declared war. In fact, by blocking the sea, you have declared war on us. And so we will not wait for you to do anything. And so they had to strike them preemptively, and eventually they had to open up and order. So Article 3 of that 1958 convention provides for access to the sea. Articles 4 to 7 deals with what they call the concept of the flag state. Every ship must have a flag, must have been registered with the state, and so it must have a flag. Are you with me? So if you see the ship on the sea, you know that it's a Nigerian ship, it's a Cameroonian ship and all that. If you don't have a flag, you have violated international law. You can be deemed to be a piracy ship, a pirate. Are you with me? Yes, and anything that you see, you take it there. Article 8 deals with warships. Article 13 and Article 99 of UNCLOS outlaws slavery on the sea. Articles 24 and 25, which is very relevant to us, deals with pollution, imposes upon states an obligation to ensure that they do everything necessary to avoid pollution of the high seas. And Articles 26 to 29 deal with submarine cables again and pipelines. Are there questions? Let's move on now. So we want to now look at specific aspects of the law of the sea. We will look at the EEZ, Economic Exclusive Zone, and then we'll look at the legal regime for the continental shelf. Is that okay? I said here in my slide that after years of deliberations, UNCLOS was finally signed in 1982, and among other things, it regulates maritime boundaries and also provided for exclusive economic zones. EEZs came as a result of advancement in deep sea exploration technologies, the discovery of natural resources on the seabed, and new extraction technology for these resources. So the whole idea here is that you have given us 12 nautical miles, and you have allowed us to exercise sovereignty over it. But some states, particularly maritime states, still felt that it was not fair, are you with me, that they will not be able to exercise either sovereignty or at least some exclusive rights over these other aspects of the sea, particularly because they felt it was still close to their territory. Are you with me? If for nothing, if there's pollution here, it will come to haunt them. If there are adverse consequences, they will suffer for it. You know, so why shouldn't we have some benefits over the natural resources, you know, extending beyond here? And so this is what will now bring us to the concept of the EEZ on the one hand and the continental shelf on the other. In explaining, to give us proper perspective, I will try and explain both of them together, and we'll look at the legal regime for the continental shelf, legal regime for the exclusive economic zone. We'll compare both of them. My daughter, close your book. What is doing you now? Didn't you hear me before? Now what for now? I will send you out of my class. So. Can I continue, young people?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Good students and good lecturer. Okay, so on the one hand, there's what they call the continental shelf. So this is Nigeria. Then this is our TS, territorial sea. You know, this is the territorial sea. And like I said, beyond here is the what? High sea. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
But it is very possible that I have experienced it, you know, in my mother's town, Liberia. It's very possible that a part of the water we could have a river, but what you have in that river is covered by water, land covered by water, but it's not actually part of the ocean. Instead, what you are having is a natural prolongation. So this is the land. Are you with me? This is the land. This land that you are seeing so can prolong to these 12 nautical miles. It can still prolong beyond there up to a very long extent. It's not deep. The ocean is deep. Are you with me? The seas are deep. You know the sea is very deep. Very, very deep. But here we're talking about a part of a land that is not deep. Instead, it is a prolongation of. So this could be Nigeria. And the land in this Nigeria can prolong into the sea, 12 nautical miles, and still prolong for a long distance. Countries began to feel that even though here is covered by water, extending into the sea, it is actually a part of their land. And so why shouldn't they be able to exercise sovereignty over this land that has now prolonged into the sea? Are you with me? Because it's a natural prolongation. And so we now have the ocean. Boom. Well, what they call it, I will show you some graphs now and some pictures. So this is what they now call the continental, there's what they call the continental slope, and then we now enter into the ocean, which is very deep. This is the argument that this deep side, this part of the ocean, let's treat it as high sea. Let all the laws of freedom and all that apply here. But they should be able to exercise sovereignty over here. Are you with me?
Yes.
That was the argument. So that part of the land where that is covered by sea, but is a natural prolongation of the internal land of a country, is referred to as what? The continental shelf. That is one argument. On the other hand, we now have what they call the EEZ, where states are arguing that, okay, this is our territorial sea, 12 nautical miles. Whether or not our land prolongs into the sea, if it prolongs, then we call it a continental shelf. Are you with me?
Yes.
Whether or not it prolongs into the continental shelf, from here to a particular distance, still give us right to exercise some level of authority and all that. So there is this argument on both sides, either the continental shelf or so. We could have a country that doesn't have a continental shelf, because the moment you exceed their territorial waters, you enter into the ocean. Are you with me?
Yes.
You you enter into the ocean. But inside of this ocean, you still have natural resources and all that. Fishes, there are fishes here, natural resources, crabs, all those marine things and all that. Their argument is that let's still be able to develop these resources. Are you with me so far? And so a compromise was sought in UNCLOS. Tyler, you can't sleep now.
Yes.
No, sir. If you feel sleepy, you stand up, you move around, and then, okay. And so what UNCLOS sought to do was to provide for the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zone. A country that has a continental shelf, the EEZ will embrace its continental shelf. Do you understand? Because for the EEZ, what you are looking at is distance. For the continental shelf, what you are looking at is geography and geology. At the moment the land prolongs into the water up to a particular distance, we'll talk about it, then we should have that right. But for the EEZ, they are saying that whether or not it prolongs, the moment it gets to a particular level, we should be able to. If a country is allowed to exercise authority over the EEZ, then whether it has a continental shelf or not has been subsumed into that right of the EEZ. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Now, so let's start with the exclusive economic zone. Just for purpose of recording, coastal states have sovereign rights to explore and exploit, conserve and manage the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of the water superjacent to the seabed and of the seabed and the subsoil, and with regard to other activities for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone of the EEZ, of course, such as the production of energy from water, currents and winds. They also have jurisdiction to establish and use artificial islands and installation structures. But to ensure that we don't have a state exercising unlimited authority, international law says that the EEZ must not extend beyond 200 nautical miles. Open that, please. Let me take water. Give me water there, my daughter. Is it clear enough?
Yes.
I will take questions soon. Thank you, dear. In Nigeria, we drink, for purpose of the recording, we drink water called pure water in sachets. You know this video is going all over the world. You know that?
Yes.
Good. People say, no, let me give you bottled water. No, this is the one I drink at home. I'm not impressing anybody. Am I impressing anybody?
No.
Thank you, Lord. So, Article 57, you want to see the provision for EEZ in Articles 56 and 57 and all that. But let me just give you background again for purpose of the recording. EEZs are at the center of a debate on the extent of exclusive rights which some coastal countries assumed. Coastal states or coastline states demanded economic zones outside their territorial waters. The freedom of navigation for marine vessels in those areas remained largely unaffected according to maritime agreements. UNCLOS is a compromise between countries wishing to expropriate more territory at sea, which may yield more natural resources, and others which operated large fleets and so wish to limit EEZs as much as possible in order to ensure as much freedom of navigation. So I'll explain. These coastal countries were arguing that we should have, exclusive zones. When we use the word exclusive, it means no other person can. You understand?
Yes.
Yeah, you can exclude any other person. Nobody can do anything there without your permission. That was the argument. But on the other hand, you have maritime countries that have a lot of capacity to benefit from the sea. Example is Japan, China, America. These are countries that have large fishing trawlers, vessels, that go all over the world, because remember that the sea belongs to nobody. Is that also?
Yes.
And so these vessels can go all over the world, trapping huge amount of marine resources and all that. Then you have countries in Africa, for example, like Nigeria, Tanzania. These are maritime countries that are concerned that you are taking all because if you say it is free for everybody, it means anybody can come now. But we're saying we want to have some exclusive zones so that we can exclusively benefit from these natural resources. And so there was this argument back and forth. The countries arguing for EEZs wanted even more. The countries that are maritime, powerful countries wanted to limit it. And so the compromise they arrived was 200 nautical miles. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
So the concept of the EEZ is of comparatively recent origin. It arose following debates and ultimately was given effect with the execution of UNCLOS. So you want to look at Articles 7, Articles 33, and generally want to look at Part 5 of UNCLOS. Part 5 of UNCLOS, which comprises of Articles 55 to 57. So like I've already told you, it is described as the area of the sea extending to 200 nautical miles. If you convert it to kilometers, it is 370.65 kilometers. But let's just stay with 200 nautical miles, in respect of which a state may exercise its rights for the purpose of, I'm emphasizing it again, for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing the natural resources, whether renewable or not, of the seabed and subsoil and its adjacent waters within such areas. Seabed, the floor. Are you with me? Subsoil, you have now dug into the sea, you have dug into the floor. That's where you get the oil from. Or superjacent waters, the waters covering that area. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Good. So in order to designate an area as its economic exclusive zone, a country must enact a specific law specifying the exact boundaries of its EEZ, and it must formulate a policy governing maritime movement in that area. Then it must file that law. A copy of that law must be filed with the United Nations, but it does not require any UN mandate or authority to take effect. Just to point out that countries that are very close, neighboring boundary countries, maritime countries that have maritime boundaries may have an issue if they are trying to designate their exclusive economic zone. And so there are some countries that are neighbors: Cyprus, Turkey, Libya, basically these countries. And so if you are designating your EEZ as 200 nautical miles, and this one, which your neighbor here is designating his EEZ as 200 nautical miles, my son, stand small. 200 nautical miles, there can be a clash because it may not be enough. I don't even understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
Yes, and so those countries must have to come together and then have an agreement on how to amicably delineate what is their EEZ. So please, if you have time, look at the issue that has been arising of late with Israel. I may ask you an example if you like to play. Israel, Turkey, and Cyprus, Libya, and all that. So what I wrote here in my slide is that because the Mediterranean Sea is relatively small, it's of a relatively small area. Mediterranean is not a very large sea like the Atlantic. The eventuality of all its coastline countries declaring EEZs would amount to there being no unclaimed sea left. What do I mean? If Turkey says my EEZ is 200, Cyprus say my own is 200, Libya my own is 200. Are you with me? Israel, I don't think Israel has direct access, but let's assume 200. in the end, we may not even have any sea that is open for all. That is the issue. But I want you to do some further reading around it and then come up with your conclusions. What has Nigeria done with respect to the EEZ? We'll come to Nigerian legislation with respect to the EEZ, international waters, and all that. But I hope you have an idea of what we're talking about, the exclusive economic zone. Yes, and we're just to emphasize it that it does not depend on depth, it does not depend on geological formations, but it depends on length, 200 nautical miles. But now we now come to the legal regime for the continental shelf. Legal regime for the continental shelf. I've already given you an explanation of what the continental shelf is. Minutes. Again, to give us background, originally states claiming fishery jurisdiction, claimed fishery jurisdiction in what you call the superjacent waters. But over time, some authors began to argue that the part of the sea that is a prolongation of their land territory should be reserved exclusively for those states, particularly for purpose of fishing. And one of the authors in this regard was a man called Stoney, S-T-O-R-N-I, who wrote a paper in 1916 arguing for the continental shelf. His work was also taken over and developed further, or it influenced a man called Suarez, also of Argentina, whose work eventually influenced the Portuguese delegation to the 7th International Fisheries Convention of 1921, who in turn influenced Barbosa de Magaches, who was one of the 3 members of the subcommittee which reported in 1927 to the Committee of Experts prior to the Hague Codification Conference. This is just to give us some background again. So over time, some countries have always felt that they should be able to extend some of these rights even beyond what you call the territorial sea. For example, the United Kingdom and France had sought to exploit or exercise fishing rights, exclusive fishing rights, if you may, over some territories that they had authority over. So, for example, a place called Ceylon, that is what we now call Sri Lanka. I think so. Yes, Sri Lanka. So Britain used to exercise fishing rights over the part of the sea extending beyond the territorial waters. In the same way, France used to exercise fishing rights over Tunis, which is what we call Tunisia today, because these were all colonies of France and Britain, Britain and France, respectively, as the case may be. So there had been such attempts by countries to say the territorial sea is not sufficient, we should be able to exercise certain rights, but it became stronger following what you call the Truman Declaration or Proclamation of September 1945. So Truman was the president of America. I think he was the person that authorized the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so he was the person who came and declared that the United States of America from henceforth will exercise rights over what you call the continental shelf. And of course, when America has taken a pathway, many countries tend to toe the line. And so a lot of countries also now began to insist that they would exercise some form of authority over the continental shelf. Are you with me so far? The nature of all these claims were later incorporated into the Geneva Convention of 1958, or the Convention on the Continental Shelf. Okay, so I'll just read what I have here. The new rules governing the claim and expectation of the continental shelf under international law, the rules were first inserted in Article 1 of the Continental Shelf Convention of 1958, which defined it as the seabed listen, the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas adjacent to the coast, but outside the area of the territorial sea, to a depth of 200 meters or beyond that limit, to where the depth of the superjacent waters admits of the exploitation of the natural resources of the said areas. Okay, so I'll just try and give us some explanation here. When we talk about the, remember when we talk about the exclusive economic zone, our concern is not about depth. Are you with me? So it's under the chair. Our concern is not about depth, but thank you, my son. You have been very helpful. Our concern is not about depth, but about what? Length. And I told us that when we talk about natural prolongation of the land itself, so this is Nigeria, and this is our coastline, but we are saying that it just goes down. It's not very deep. Instead, it just goes down like this. And so they are saying that the depth of the water, so if the water is going to cover, if the water is going to cover the land, it should not go beyond 200 meters, which is not very deep. When we talk about the ocean, we are talking about serious depth. You can drop a skyscraper in the ocean and it will sink. Are you aware of that? Do you know?
Yes.
Are you aware? Yes, a skyscraper of 20 stories. 20 stories. A skyscraper. You can drop it inside the ocean and the ocean will cover it. It is that deep. There are depths in the ocean that no human being can survive. So what they do now for purpose of research and navigation is to use what? Robots. If you watch National Geographic from time to time, you will see white people on the sea and they drop these robots to go into the very depth. No human being, no matter the gear you put, oxygen, and you can't survive. So they have to use robots to go into the very depths of the sea and to now, video, know what is happening, take pictures of animals, and the sharks are moving away, the sharks are back, this one, that one, and all that. And those are the documentaries that we watch from time to time and all that. But here we are looking at a part of the sea that is not deep. And so we say it's just a natural prolongation. So as against something going deep like this, it's just something like this. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
I'll show you some pictures very soon. So like I said, it is the seabed and subsoil of the submarine area adjacent to the coast, but outside the area of the territorial sea, to a depth of what? To a depth of what? How many meters? 200 meters. Or beyond that limit, to where the depth of the superjacent waters admits of the exploitation of the natural resources of that area. So the continental shelf is a geological expression in essence. It's a geological expression. It's a part of the high sea, but it is the submerged prolongation of a country's land territory. Never you forget that. It is the submerged. So this is our land territory. This is part of our land that is now covered by water. Example, we had a flood that hit Bayelsa recently. And you see the flood submerging land. But we all know that this is our land. It's just that it is covered by what? Water. You can even use your leg and walk. Most of you were taking pictures and putting it on Facebook. Most of you were affected. But it's land that is submerged with water. So it refers to the ledges that project from the continental landmass into the seas and which are covered with only a relatively shallow layer of water, some 150 to 200 meters depth, and which eventually fall away into the ocean. So it goes like this, like this, like this, like this. It now falls. Are you with me? Are you with me?
Yes.
Where it falls now, the continental shelf has stopped. So a country's continental shelf may not reach the 200. It may stop at where? 100. It may stop at 90. International law says for purpose of let there not be wahala, because it's possible that your continental shelf can even reach 1,000 nautical miles. Are you with me? If it reaches 1,000 nautical miles, you cannot say you are claiming it ad infinitum. Are you with me? So we are putting a limit to you that even if your continental shelf extends to 1,000 nautical miles, when you get to 200, you must what? Stop. If it is less, you stop at. So the moment you pass your 12 miles territorial sea, and you now have a continental shelf of 90, you stop there and exercise those rights that we're going to give you there. If it gets to 150, no problem. If it gets to 200, no problem. Once it passes 200, we have to discuss differently. So the continental shelf, where does it stop? It stops at the point where the thing now slopes into the ocean. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
So let me read it again. It refers to the ledges that project from the continental landmass into the seas and which are covered with only a relatively shallow layer of water and which eventually fall away into the ocean depths, which are some thousands of meters deep. So the ocean can be 20,000 meters deep, 50,000 meters deep, 8,000 meters. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Again, I'm still explaining what the continental shelf is. Grace, listen, oh.
Yes.
No lecturer will take time to explain like this. When you go to international law, the man may not have this time. So listen, if you follow me, you have an edge over your colleagues. This thing I'm telling you has taken me years to understand. I even met my cousin who is doing geography. She does not even know her left from her right. Geography. I even called my wife's colleague, who is a geologist, to have this understanding I'm giving you. So better listen. Can we continue?
Yes, sir.
So it is that part of the continental margin between the shoreline and the shelf break, or where there is no noticeable slope, between the shoreline and the point where the depth of the superjacent waters is approximately between 100 and 200 meters. So to define the continental shelf, we look at two things. Number one, we look at depth. Say depth.
Yes.
Then number two, we look at length. Say length.
Length.
So for length, you mustn't pass 200 nautical miles. Is that so?
Yes.
And for depth, the moment the thing, so use your territorial sea, then, and this is your claim that our land, so this is Nigeria, our land extends to the territorial sea, 12 nautical miles, sovereignty, no wahala, and our land is still covered by water, Oga, 200 meters. The moment it gets to 300, it must stop. We can treat it as your EEZ, but we cannot treat it as your what? Continental shelf. You will discover as you look at it that the rights in the EEZ are different from the rights in the continental shelf. The rights you have over your continental shelf are different. Okay, so let's continue. Just to point out again that the continental shelves, cumulatively, continental shelves of the various coastal states take up some between 7 to 8% of the total area of the ocean. And their extent varies considerably from place to place. And the shelf is also rich in oil and gas resources as well as fishing resources. So again, various countries, when you combine all the continental shelves that we have in the world, they constitute about 7 to 8% of the total body of the sea that we have in the world. So it is quite significant as well. Okay, so I just want to show you some pictures so you have some rough idea of what we are trying to say. My daughter, Comfort, can you clean that for me? Thank you. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you.
For in thy presence there is healing divine. No other power can heal or die. It's okay, daughter. Thank you. Holy Spirit, thou art welcome in this place. Oh, yes, Lord. Okay, so you are seeing the coast. Are you seeing the coast?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is Nigeria. And then you can see the land. You can see the difference between this land and here is not much. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
It's not deep. So, but it's covered by water. The blue is the water. That's what they are arguing. That even though here is now part of the IC, for God's sake, it's part of our land that just extends, that is now covered by water. That is the argument. And so long it's not beyond 200 meters deep, we should allow. So now it's beginning to slope. Are you seeing that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, beginning to slope. If we begin to slope, continental rise, you are now entering into what you call the continent. You now enter into the ocean. I'll give you another picture. This one is coming from. It's coming from here. Sorry, my daughter, I'm covering. So you can still see the idea. You see the continental shelf.
Yes.
Yes. So see the land. It prolongs. Just goes. It's not very deep. Now start to slope. Enter into the ocean and ocean depth. So we want to now look at what are the rights. I'll give you a third picture. This one is not very big. Okay. You are seeing the continental shelf.
Yes.
Yes. So you can see. I can move this. So this is the land, the shore, and it just enters into the water. The water is covered with blue, but it's almost the same. Then it begins to slope, begins to go down and so. So they are saying that this shelf and this land are almost the same thing. And so why shouldn't we have certain rights, particularly if there's petroleum there? So what did international law do is what we want to now look at. Oh, glory. Okay, so let's just briefly look at the definition in UNCLOS. Where is that thing I used to block you before? Excellent. Okay, so please see Article 76. So is this thing showing my face?
Yes.
Good. Article 76 of the UNCLOS definition for and the continental shelf again. I'll just still read it again. It's the seabed and subsoil. Please listen. It's the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin. That is the first definition. The other definition is that, or it is to a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, where the outer edge of the continental margin does not extend up to that distance. To a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, where the outer edge of the continental margin does not extend up to that distance. So first, let's look at the rights. I'll still come back to the definition again. But let's look at the rights now. Article 76 sub 4, when you have time, look at it. For purpose of the convention, the coastal state shall establish the outer edge of the continental margin, where the margin extends beyond 200 nautical miles from the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured. So I don't want to go into too much. It's a little bit complex. just take the definition I've given you. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because it has a lot of geological terminologies, and just take that understanding that I have given you. Okay, so what is the continental margin? Just for your knowledge, it encompasses the continental shelf, the continental slope, and the continental rise. So when you are looking at the convention and you come across the word continental margin, just know that it encompasses the continental shelf itself, the slope, and the continental rise. But our focus now are rights of coastal states over their continental shelves. Number one is that they have exclusive right to exercise sovereignty for the purpose of exploring and exploiting natural resources. It is exclusive in the sense that if the coastal state does not exploit, no other state may do so without its express consent. These rights do not depend on occupation, effective or notional, or on any express proclamation. Remember, for the exclusive economic zone, you need to expressly proclaim, pass a law, submit the law to the UN. Are you with me?
Yes, sir.
For the continental shelf, you don't need to do that. The rights do not depend on occupation, effective or notional, or on any express proclamation. Now the question is, what type of natural resources does the country has over the exclusive, over the continental shelf? For the continental shelf, your rights are limited only to, first of all, the seabed and the subsoil. It does not extend to the waters. It does not. And so if there are fishes in the river there, other countries can also fish there. It's not an exclusive right. Are you with me? Yeah, if it's a continental shelf, other countries can also fish there. Your rights are limited to the seabed and subsoil. So if there are natural resources in the ground, you can drill and then produce. Other countries cannot do that because in your continental shelf. But if it is fishing, other countries still has rights to occupy or possess the resources. So what types of natural resources does the country have? Number one, mineral and non-living resources of the seabed and subsoil. Living organisms belonging to sedentary species, that is to say organisms which are the harvestable stage, either are immobile or under the seabed, or unable to move except in constant physical contact with the seabed or subsoil. So all those things, there are some animals that are on the seabed that are not really moving. You can go and take them. Are you with me?
Yes.
But when it comes to fishes that are moving, it's a general right that other states can produce, can go and express. So look at Article 77. See also Article 81 of UNCLOS. So states have the right to drill, to authorize and regulate drilling on the continental shelf for all purposes as well. They could also construct installations as well. So you want to see that in Article 2 of the Continental Sea Convention of 1958. Now, I talked about if the continental shelf exceeds 200 nautical miles, what is the country to do? Is it to exercise those authorities forever? Please see Article 76, subparagraph 7 to subparagraph 9. If the continental shelf exceeds 200 nautical miles, the country is to delineate the outer limits by straight lines, not exceeding 60 nautical miles in length, connecting fixed points defined by coordinates of latitude and longitude. And they are to inform the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf on the basis of equitable geographical representation. Again, drilling beyond 200 miles, drilling beyond 200 nautical miles, see Article 80. Please get the recording after and ensure you make your notes as well. So please see Article 80. But we want to compare the continental shelf and the EEZ. What are the major differences? I said before, and I want to say it again. For the continental shelf, your right is only for the subsoil and where seabed. For the EEZ, you have rights over the seabed, the subsoil, and the water. Not all countries have continental shelves, but all countries may have exclusive economic zones. Exclusive economic zones. The continental shelf may extend beyond 200 nautical miles depending on depth, size, and geophysical properties of the seabed and subsoil. Some of the fishery, but for EEZ, some of the fishery rights exercised in EEZs do not apply. For the EEZ, it may not extend beyond 200 nautical miles. And lastly, some of the fishery rights exercised in the EEZ, such as the right to fish, do not apply to the continental shelf, even if it extends beyond 200 nautical miles. So it's a little bit technical and then complex, but you have to continue to read, and come to have an understanding of some of these things. Some of them are a bit too technical if you don't need to, but at least you should be able to have the major basic knowledge. Are you with me?
Yes.
Of first of all, what is the EEZ, and then what are the rights that states have, and the EEZ, and what are the rights that states have in the continental shelf as well, and just at least have that basic knowledge, know the provisions in the article, know the articles in UNCLOS, and where necessary, the articles in the 1958 convention as well, and I think you should be able to discuss it wherever you find yourself. Now let's look at how does Nigeria dominate its offshore petroleum resources. I will run through the legal regime, please, because we must end this class by 1. I have another meeting. First of all, I will run through some of the laws. We have the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999. We have the Territorial Waters Act, 1967 as amended. We have the Oil in Navigable Waters Act of 1968. We have the Oil Terminal Dues Act of 1969. We have the Petroleum Act of 1969. We have the EEZ Act of 1978. We have the Offshore Oil Revenue Registration Grants Act of 1972. And then we have the Petroleum Industry Act of which year? 2021. But before we look at that, let's just take a trip back to history. You want to look at the Mineral Oils Act. Mineral Oils Act. Remember that law or Mineral Oil Ordinance was enacted in 1914. Is that not so?
Yes.
And it gave Nigeria authority and jurisdiction over all the natural resources. Of course, that jurisdiction was first of all vested in the British monarch and was subsequently given to the federal government of Nigeria upon the attainment of independence in 1960. But just to point out that in 1950, that act was amended for the authority to extend to the submarine areas of whatever constituted Nigeria's territorial waters. So that was the first thing. 1950, an amendment to the act gave the Crown the authority over the submarine areas. In 1959, another amendment was also introduced that empowered the federal legislature to extend its future legislative competence on mines and minerals which cover the areas beneath other waters. It extended the geographical areas of the waters in respect of which Nigerian laws on mining and minerals will apply, and brought the Nigerian continental shelf within the purview of Nigerian law. You may sit properly. Good. So that's just to give you a background that originally the British government focused on the land, but eventually they began to extend the rights, because as these developments occurred in international law, and they also translated most of them into domestic legislation. So I've pointed out the laws for us. When you go home, look at Section 2, subsection 3 of the Oil in Navigable Waters Act. These are laws that have bearing on the development of Nigeria's petroleum resources, and that as they are found offshore. Some of them are environmental inclined, others have to do with customs and imposition of taxes, and others have to do with exploration and exploitation. So the Oil in Navigable Waters Act is a law that is an environmental protection law that seeks to protect the environment from pollution. Are you with me? And it empowers the federal government of Nigeria to exercise that authority over the Nigeria's waters. So you want to see section 2, subsection 3. Then you want to see section 7 of the Oil Terminal Dues Act, which essentially authorizes the federal government of Nigeria to impose certain dues. If a ship is leaving Nigeria and a tanker comes to Nigeria to take oil and is taking it to Korea, before moving, they will have to pay some dues. Are you with me? That is the terminal dues. So you want to see section 7 of the Oil Terminal Dues Act. You want to see section 1, subsection 1 of the Petroleum Act, which eventually is a generalized provision providing that all oil found within Nigeria, within its territorial sea, continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, belong to the federal government of Nigeria. So it's a proclamation. You know, that is also repeated in section 44 of the Constitution, section 44, subsection 3 of the Constitution, and you find that I think in section 1 of the PIA as well. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
You look also at section 18, subsection 1 of the Interpretation Act, and section 1, subsection 3 of the Offshore Oil Revenues Registration of Grants Act. Okay, so we're almost done. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about the Territorial Waters Act. Let me just run through, for the purpose of my recording, run through its key provisions. So it's Territorial Waters Act of 1967. Nigeria originally claimed 3 nautical miles. Remember, the original claim was 3 because they were using the power of the arm. But UNCLOS has extended it to what? Good. So Nigeria claimed 3 nautical miles under that 1967 Act. And then, in fact, later Nigeria extended it to 12. And by 1971, they even extended it to 30 nautical miles. But it now reduced it back again to 12 in 1998, following an amendment to the Territorial Waters Amendment Act as well. So Section 1, subsection 5 of the Act preserves and maintains the grounds earlier made for exploration, oil exploration of areas already covered in territorial waters. And Section 1 defines the territorial waters and empowers the federal government to legislate over it. And basically, that is what you need to know. For the exclusive economic zone, we also have a legislation in 1978, Exclusive Economic Zone Act. What that law did was to give effect to the treaty that preceded. So there had been a treaty preceding the 1982 convention, and that act sought to give effect to it and all that. So basically, Section 1 delimits the EEZ as being an area extending from the external limits of the territorial waters up to a distance of 200 nautical miles and all that. And of course, being exclusive, only the federal government of Nigeria can exploit for and develop that resource. Now let's briefly look at derivation. And offshore resources. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you,
Let's take a break for 5 minutes. Let me catch some breaths. 5 minutes for 5 minutes. My son, pause it. You don't. Good. So we want to, in the next 30 minutes before we call it a day, want to look at the derivation and offshore. For Nigeria as a country, I believe you have already looked at, my colleague had already dealt with ownership of theories of ownership. with you. Has he done that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, and I want to believe you have some basic idea of some of those theories: ownership in place, absolute ownership, and the rule of capture, and all that. Most of those are just theories applicable mostly in the United States of America. For the rest of the world, what happens generally is that petroleum is located or situated in the states. The federal government, because of the strategic and economic nature of petroleum as a resource, it's usually vested in the people, and the government manages it. But what usually happens is that in federal governments, they usually provide for derivation. In unitary systems like Britain and Norway, they don't usually have any provision for derivation. So Scotland, for example, even though it's a country, doesn't have any right of derivation. Rather, what happens is that the government collects taxes from these companies and then creates a level playing ground for them to compete amongst themselves. For countries with federal constitutions like Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, Iraq, and for a number of other federal constitutions, they usually provide for what we call a revenue sharing formula. Are you with me? I believe you did that in your second year. So a revenue sharing formula, it's a formula that the government will use in sharing formula amongst the federating units. And they could use a formula such as what? Epitome, example of the formulas that they use to share revenue. Population, yes. Need, N-E-E-D, need. What else? Land mass, equity, derivation. So derivation is just one of the several revenue sharing formulas, and from time to time the National Assembly of a particular country will be required. So budget for this year, we will be giving 80% of our budget to Adamawa State because they have been ravaged by flood. That is an example. We are looking at what need, or we'll be giving 70% to Lagos because of the population, immense population has put an immense weight on the infrastructure, and we cannot allow the Lagos State government to bear that burden alone. It is believed that about 200,000 people enter into Lagos every day. 200,000, I don't know how true, and so we could use population as a basis for allocating revenue. For example, some states are sparsely populated. A number of states in the north are like deserts. They have land mass. So land mass is also one of the formulas, but you could have land mass and not have population. Are you with me so far? Yes. Then derivation. Derivation simply says that we will send back to you if we get from you. So where we derive the money from should have more. Are you with me?
Yes.
So it's a way to also ensure that there's equity and justice, and to address the concerns of those regions that are probably contributing more. So a region may contribute more to the federal purse, not necessarily because it has natural resources, but because of its high level of technological competence. A good example is California, where you have the Silicon Valley. They may not have so much natural resources, but most of the big tech companies in America, these are multinational entities with revenues in excess of what some governments, some countries have. For example, Apple as a company generates more than a number of African countries. I don't think Nigeria generates as much as Apple, and I think the headquarters is in Silicon Valley. Facebook, and a number of them. So we could use the fact that we generate 85% of our taxes from this region to give back to that region as a way to also support them to be more entrepreneurial and to introduce measures to ramp up commerce. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Now, in applying derivation, we could also look at if our economy or our government is deriving so much from the sale of natural resources, then we want to also have a derivation formula that if we take 100 naira from the sale of natural resources like cobalt or gold or diamond or silver, whatever, then we want to give back a particular amount of or a percentage back. And so that is where the Niger Delta issue comes in, which I think you should have some grasp of having passed through this class. The 1960 was when Nigeria became independent, and we had a constitution referred to as the 1960 Independence Constitution. Under that constitution, Nigeria was still a territory of the British government. If you recall, we did not have an executive president, nor did we have a non-executive president. Rather, what we had was a governor general who was a representative of the Queen. Who was that person? Who was that person? Our first governor general. First, after independence. Yes, please. His name was Nnamdi Azikiwe. Yes, so in 1960, Nigeria became an independent country, but it was still a territory of Britain, and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was the prime minister. In 1963, Nigeria now transited to becoming a what? Republic. Yes, so we moved from being a monarchy to being a republic, and in being a republic, Nnamdi Azikiwe now became the first president, although he was still a non-executive president, but he was still the first president of an independent Republican Nigeria. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Those constitutions, 63 and 60, are substantially the same thing with respect to derivation. Among other things, they provided that where the petroleum is obtained from, please listen, would have 50%. 50% will be given back to the area from whence the petroleum, not just petroleum, but the natural resources are derived from. Are you with me?
Yes.
Yes, so that is the first provision. Secondly, of the remaining 50%, there was to be a pool, what we call a federation account, to which 30% of the remaining 50% will be paid. And from that 30%, the regions, then we had just 4 regions, or no, 3 regions, East, West, North. I think 1967 we now had the Midwest. So the 3 regions of East, West, and North were to derive or benefit from the federation account of how many percent? How many percent? 30. 50 has gone to the region from whence you took the natural resource. 30 is paid to the federation account. The remaining 20 will now be paid to the federal government, to drive government, pay soldiers, pay the police, and all that. So that was the arrangement, and it was overall felt that it was just, because 50% is a very significant amount of money which improperly applied should translate into economic well-being for the people. But you know what happened? That arrangement did not last. There was disturbance in the West, 1964, elections, Awolowo and Akintola, Lakode Akintola, they had so much problems. The West became turbulent, ungovernable, and riding on the wings of the political disturbances, the military struck in 1966, 15th of what? Armed Forces Remembrance Day, my dear students. 15th of what? January, the military struck, and of course the first thing they did was to suspend portions of the Constitution, not everything, but portions of the Constitution. And among the portions they suspended was Section 140, subsection 6, which provided for derivation. It was suspended. What this meant was that all the natural resources derived from any region was paid exclusively to the federal government. In 1960, around June, July, there was a counter coup when Murtala Mohammed I don't know if a passenger, Gowon and a number of the Northerners, they struck back, and then they killed the man, Agu Ironsi, and so Gowon began to rule, and of course, Odimego Ojukwu, who was the governor of the East, he rebelled, and then we had this war for nearly 3 years and all that. After the war, towards the end of the war, because the war devastated the country, nearly 3 million people died, the economy was destroyed and all that. And it was during that period that Nigeria also began to transit from depending on agriculture to depending on petroleum. The importance of petroleum as an economic resource was brought stronger as the war ended, because there was need to rebuild and reconstruct the country. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
And so in 1971, an act was passed, the Offshore Oil Revenues Act of 1961. The first thing that act did, because remember, again, you can't sleep. Oh. Good. The focus of our study now is not derivation, but onshore, offshore. We are looking at international law as it pertains to our offshore resources. Is that not so?
Yes, sir.
And I told us that one of the things you will study before we end this class is the extent to which Nigeria dominates its offshore resources. And we have run through those laws. And I also told us we will now look at the extent to which littoral or coastal states like Bayelsa, Ondo, Delta, and rivers, they benefit from this resource. That is our focus. Our focus now is not derivation. Our focus is this thing. And so in 1971, a law was enacted. 1971, a law was enacted called the Offshore Oil Revenues Act. What this law did was to create a dichotomy, to say every petroleum found offshore doesn't belong to Bayelsa or any of the states adjacent to the sea. It should be paid to the coffers of the Federation and now distributed to the 36 states. Then, of course, it wasn't 36 states. Maybe I think around 12 states or so. So if at all we must use derivation, you can only derive from the natural resources that are gotten from land. The moment we go to the territorial sea and beyond, we are paying it directly to the coffers of the federal government of Nigeria. Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
Good. So for us in the Niger Delta, we saw this as a form of deprivation and oppression, of the rich over the poor. And I believe a number of you are old enough to have some understanding of the agitations that have occurred since. So please, when you have time, look at my book. How many of us have seen my book on local content oil and gas law? Have you read it? How many of us have read it? Read chapter 9, that should be the last chapter. I made mention of some of these things I'm saying, and it's there in the library. We have like 5 copies. So with the entrance of the military into the political sphere, there was an incremental deprivation of the oil-bearing states through the instrumentality of laws. So the 1971 law now created a dichotomy for the first time. Remember, the 1960 Constitution and 1963 Constitution said that for purpose of deprivation, offshore and onshore are one and the same. That is what that Constitution provided. And so every petroleum derived off the coast of Brass will be deemed to have been taken from Brass. And so if we are paying Brass, let's assume Brass is a state, we are paying Brass 50%, then we'll pay out 50% of the one onshore and the one where offshore. The 1971 law, of course, the military decree said no, there is now a dichotomy. Offshore, take it to Abuja. Then it was Lagos. Then onshore, you can now share and give you your part. Offshore, no sir, it's not your own. And so there was an incremental deprivation. If we look at the slide, 1971 to 1975, the NDRO stands for what? NDRO stands for what? Niger Delta region. NDRO revenues from petroleum produced onshore in the region was reduced to 45%, and between 1975 to 79 it was reduced to 20. 79 to 81, nothing was allocated at all in the 1979 constitution did not provide for derivation. That was Obasanjo's work. That is his legacy. Now he's the one talking. If you look at yourself and your own faults, you will not be quick to judge. Is that not so?
Yes.
And the Bible says, judge not, lest you not be judged. When you hear Obasanjo talk now, it's like she's such a righteous old man, who wants the best for the country. But if you now go and look at his own historical and legacy, you discover that he had a lot of things that he did wrong. I have a relative, when she's talking about other people, she'll talk as though she has so much sense. But when you carry that same hand and point it to her, she will not be able to talk because she has done a lot of rubbish. God help us in Jesus' name.
Amen.
You're advising people's children. Your own children are watching television till 2 o'clock in the morning. You are the one telling people to train their children well. You can't train your own. No. But it's very easy to advise other people. Is that not so?
Yes.
Advice is easy. Your daughters have boyfriends all over town, and you are the one advising people's children. It's so easy to preach. Any idiot can preach. Can we come back?
Yes, sir.
Good. Okay, so that was Obasanjo's legacy. 0 allocation. So derivation from petroleum revenues was marginally increased to 1.5% from between 1982 to 1992. And from 1992 to 1999, there was some attempt to increase it to 3%. Of course, you know that with the 1999 constitution, it was now increased to what? Comfort. What is the percentage now? Current
30.
derivation.
30.
What section is that? What section is that? That my daughter, what's your name again? Dara, what section is that? 162. Section 162 of the 1979 Constitution provide for. Come in, please. My learner senior. I'll come and see you. 8 minutes from now, I'm done.
Okay, I'm upstairs with you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can I continue, my friends?
Yes, sir.
So the 1962 Constitution authorizes the National Assembly to pass a law and to designate a revenue formula. And in doing so, derivation must not be less than 13%. It can be more. It must not be less than 13%. So the law did not say, Constitution did not say 13%. Constitution says nothing less than. Are you with me?
Yes.
Yeah, so that nothing less than is what they have just accepted as the norm. So when they say Niger Delta states, it's 13%. But the National Assembly can increase it. But of course they will not, because our northern brothers are already complaining that we have more than enough. Number 2, we have not been able to account for what we have been using, and to some extent they are right, to some extent they are wrong. To say we have more than enough is wrong. To say we have not adequately accounted for what we have received, they are right. And a man who is asking for more should also show what he has done with the little he has and all that. So it's a pity anyway. But the truth is that even if you give some states 80%, Niger Delta states, people will still be poor, very poor. So I have never believed in derivation, because I have seen that 13% has not lifted us from poverty. Almost all of us here are poor. It's just that you don't know that you are poor. All of us here were all poor people. How? Ask me how. You cannot call, I don't think any of you can call any of his uncles now and say, Uncle, raise me 200 million. I have. No, I'm just giving an example that now you have a job, you have a contract, you have graduated as a young lawyer, and you have a job, a contract that you want to execute urgently, and you need one of your relatives to support you. Maybe he can even be a partner in the company. Let him bring 200 million. They don't have. So we are that poor. But it's not like that in the West, in Yoruba land. It's not like that. There people have money. Are you with me? People have money. you can have an uncle that can just come and train. He can train everybody in the family, send them abroad because they are rich, so we are still very poor, but I pray that we have to break. I mean, I've broken out of it anyway, just that I want my loved ones to also come out, my relatives. Thank you, Lord. We're almost done. My dean is waiting for me. Okay, so the 1999 Constitution, like I said, now said, let it be minimum of what? 13%, section 162, and then that has now been taken as the norm. So you can see that. But the issue now is, when Nigeria returned back to civilian rule in 1999, the Niger Delta question now came out more forcefully, and among other things, the oil-bearing states, the coastal states that are also rich in oil, because from this class that over 90% of Nigeria's petroleum resources are located in the Niger Delta region, either onshore or offshore. Are you with me?
Yes.
And the agitation was that 1971 law was an injustice. We should remove the onshore-offshore dichotomy. This was more because Nigeria increasingly began to exploit for its petroleum offshore. And the federal government felt no, that law should stand. And so the matter went to the Supreme Court. And you know that for states having problems with the federal government, the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. Is that so?
Yes.
And there's no appeal. And so the matter went to the Supreme Court in AG Federation versus AG Abia. You have to look at that case. Have you read it? You mean you didn't read it in year 2? In constitutional law? It's not possible. It's not possible that somebody will teach you constitutional law and not teach you this case. So, AG Federation versus AG Abia, the federal government took all the states in Nigeria to Supreme Court to determine where does the right of the littoral states end, for purpose of derivation. Do the littoral states have the right to benefit from petroleum in the continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, and territorial sea? Or does Bayelsa start from the low water mark? Because remember I talked about the low water mark, from where we begin to. So the argument is that, for example, Bayelsa stops with the low water mark. From the low water mark inside is Bayelsa. From the low water mark outward is not Bayelsa, it's the sea. Are you with me? Bayelsa and the sea are not the same thing. That is the territorial sea, and if it is the sea, Nigeria is able to develop and exploit for those petroleum resources, not by virtue of any local law, but by virtue of international law. That was set up properly. And so that was the argument. Rotimi Williams was their lawyer, and we, these 36 states, particularly the littoral states, were also able to align themselves to also argue and all that. And the Supreme Court, I think Ogunta did JSC and all that, was the one who gave the lead judgment. They agreed with them. So I'll just read the contention of the FGN is that the southern or seaward boundary of each state is the low water mark of the land surface, blah, blah, blah. For the states, its territory extends beyond the low water mark onto the territorial water, even onto the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zone. But the Supreme Court agreed with them and held that riparian owners, for riparian owners, the seaward extent of their land territory at common law is the low water mark of the seaward limit of the internal waters. This is so because at common law, the sea shore or foreshore both mean the same thing, and they both belong to the crown. The shore is that ground that is between the ordinary high water and low water mark. Thus, both prima facie and of common right belong to the king, both in the shore of the sea and on the shore of the arms of the sea. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
So the littoral states lost grace. Focus, leave that phone. And so the littoral states lost their case. What that meant was that all petroleum derived offshore went directly to the federal government. You pay them into the federation account and share it the way you want to share it using your revenue allocation formula. But the littoral states do not have a right to 13%. So two forms of injustice. Remember the 1950, 1960s and 63 constitution say 50% goes to you, no distinction between offshore and offshore. You still have the right to benefit from the remaining 30%. 71 came and said no distinction. I mean, there's a distinction between offshore and offshore. And through different decrees, they incrementally reduced it until they now came to 99 and said, okay, you have suffered enough, take 13%. Take 13%. But in this 13% now, the distinction between offshore and onshore exists. The problem was that, particularly for a state like Cross River, you don't have petroleum onshore. All their petroleum that they have been benefiting from was offshore. And so when the Supreme Court gave this judgment, it meant that even all the money that Cross River had been eating, they have to return it because it was paid to them by mistake. And so the state became virtually bankrupt, and there was an outcry, and as a result of that outcry, the government now, the National Assembly, out of pity, according to them, they pitied us. They now quickly went to pass another law. It's called the Allocation of Revenue, Abolition of Dichotomy in the Application of the Principle of Derivation Act 2004. Comfort, are you with me? They passed that law, and the essence of that law is that as from the commencement of this act, the 200-meter water depth isobats contiguous to a state of the federation shall be deemed to be a part of that. So they say we will pity you, because we are pitying you from the low water mark. We'll count what? What are we counting? 200 what now? Meter water depth. That is what they are saying. They are not saying 200 miles, so 200 water meter depth. So we are now looking at your continental what? Shelf. The continental shelf of the state. 200 water meter depth. So the moment you don't pass 200 meters, forget about it. Are you with me? Are you with me? Yes. So in the 200 water meter depth is just for 8 nautical miles. Then okay, for purpose of derivation, let's say it's part of Cross River, so that you have something, you will not die of hunger. That is what they did. So those who have not read the law felt that this law has abolished. Look at the heading of the law: abolition of dichotomy in the application. That is a false heading. Are you with me? Yes. Because this law, that is the law. The law just has one section. It did not provide for exclusive economic zone. Neither does it provide for 200 nautical miles, as we used to define the continental shelf. Are you with me? Yes. It only says, as from the commencement of this act, the 200-meter water depth isobats contiguous to a state of federation shall be deemed to a part of that state for the purpose of computing the revenue according to the federation, blah, blah, blah. That is what they have done. And so, thus, the purpose of the application of the principle of derivation, it shall be immaterial whether the revenue according to the federation account from a state is derived from natural resources, based, blah, blah, blah. So, basically, that is what the federal government tried to do, to maybe alleviate them. But just note that that is where we are now. This is basically the law. But the PIA provided for host communities. My colleague has dealt with that, has he?
Yes.
Yes. In that, for purpose of benefiting from the host community fund, what is the percentage again? 3%. Yes. They said that the distinction between onshore and offshore does not exist. You know that? Just know that. So the onshore, so I may ask you in the exam, to what extent has the National Assembly sought to abolish or address the consequences of the decision of the Supreme Court in Abia, AGF versus AG Abia? You have to give me background, you have to give me foundation, and then you have to now tell me the consequence of the judgment in 2001 was that some states, example, Cross River, became virtually bankrupt and even indebted to the federal government. So to alleviate some of these concerns, that act was abolished. Point out what they provided, point out where the limits of that act, is it deep, is it extensive? You have to point that out. There are only 200 meter depth. It doesn't cover the continental shelf for the EEZ. And now point out the PIA has also tried to provide that for purpose of host community, we will not recognize any such distinction. So I'll call it a day. It's been 2 hours of, my son, pause it. You can stop it now. So the next time we are meeting,